Hello, my name is Louise Adlon-Tang, and my family comes originally from Caracat, New Brunswick. And I want to speak in regards to the history of the Acadian and Mi'kmaq people of New Brunswick, because not a lot of Canadians know the full scope of the story or how the system has oppressed people by way of colonialism. Basically, my family came from Normandy, France, and settled along areas of Nova Scotia as fishermen. They integrated with the Mi'kmaq culture who lived on the lands, and we became the Acadian people. So we were the first real settlement in Canada that was Métis. We had integrated culture. The Acadian people were relatively prosperous because the Mi'kmaq taught us how to be self-sufficient, and we had skill sets from France as well that came in with the people. And we were fishermen, we were farmers. Actually, the Acadian people created a system of farming using something called the aboiteau. The aboiteau was a way of filtering the salt out of a saltwater marsh by way of building kind of a dam-like structure. It had a flap where the salt water would enter out into the sea, but when the tide came in, it would close. And by using this system, the cold water would come from the groundwater would come, and it would flush out the salt water and reclaim these lands as farmland. Became some of the most lush farmland in all of North America. And they're still highly valued to this day. And what that did was it allowed the Acadian people the ability to raise cattle and hold them year-round. In areas of New England, for example, they would have to slaughter their cows before the winter because they couldn't get enough hay to keep them alive. Whereas we didn't have to do that. So we were considered wealthy in having the sustainable agriculture based on the cow. The reason also that they did this was because there's a lot of cliffs, and to bring water uphill to farm is difficult, but it was a creative solution, and like I said, these lands are still valued. Now, the Acadian people were really fantastic when it came to resourcefulness and creating their own stuff. Because they had little support from France. They made their own homes, they made their own materials, they made their own fabrics, they integrated with the Mi'kmaq to know what foods to eat, to know when to hunt, how to fish. All these skill sets were intermingled. And in the colonial US areas, they envied our wealth. They would come to do trade with us. We would sell them their goods, but we would sell our goods to them, but we weren't buying from them as much because we were so self-sustainable. Now, during that period of time, Jeffrey Amherst was in the areas of what's today New England area, and they were the ones that had actually wanted to separate and divide the French people and the Mi'kmaq people. And they wanted to colonialize Canada, basically. So what they did was Amherst made the order to do the genocide using the smallpox against the Mi'kmaq people. And they did this by way of handkerchiefs and blankets that were stolen from hospitals. And they would bring them to the Mi'kmaq people in wooden container and do trade with them. And they would open the box, and of course they were contaminated. But when they gave the wooden box, they were told not to open it until they got home or to their village to share the blessings. So that genocide took place. And the reason they were so hostile against the Mi'kmaq people was not only racism, but it was territorialism as well. We really have to get back to the roots of it. When Columbus had discovered America, 1 year later, Alexander VI, who was the Pope at the time, created the Doctrine of Discovery, which basically states that if you are in a non-Catholic community, you are not considered a person. And this allowed and facilitated things like the Crusade and colonialism. And it became enshrined in US policy as well as in the policies of Europe. So there was this double standard where, of course, when you land in any new country, then there's not guaranteed Catholic people there because they've never been exposed to this concept. And because of that, they felt entitled by sanction of the church to exploit the resources, the land, and to just basically disregard these beings as non-people. Okay, and that doctrine of discovery was enshrined in today's current U.S. policies. So we still see things like Guantanamo. We still see things like the war in the Gulf and the Iraq and the disregard of human life, and that kind of philosophy can't thrive in today's modern age. It is irrational. So that took place the year after Columbus discovered America, 1494, I believe it was, when the Doctrine of Discovery was enshrined by papal bull. Now, in 1610, we had the Vatican wanting to facilitate a way for the Mi'kmaq people to do trade with Europe because they wanted our furs, they wanted our goods. And because the French and Mi'kmaq had been so close, we formed the Acadian culture, Métis, that the church decided to create a different way of approaching First Nations people. The Vatican Concordat, 1610, actually identified the Mi'kmaq as a nation internationally. And it was a recognition at the European level to facilitate trade between the Mi'kmaq and Europe. And this was an actual wampum that was created. It was an agreement with the Vatican directly. It had nothing to do with the crown. So we have a Vatican to Mi'kmaq recognition of nationhood in North America. It was the first wampum of its kind like that. And so the Mi'kmaq people had been recognized as having the nation. The Acadian people lived with us. We were one territory, one people, integrated, Mi'kmaq and the Métis and the French harmoniously. Our agreement said that in order for us to maintain this treaty in good faith, we had to become Catholic. So Henri, member 2, who was the sachem of the Mi'kmaq nation, got baptized. And from that point on, all of the Mi'kmaq culture was considered a Roman Catholic faith. And so they had actually created with the church a system of writing and the teachings of the Bible in Mi'kmaq as well as in English. So this is a nation that was formed. Now, when Jeffrey Amherst abolished the Mi'kmaq people, it wasn't a nation-to-nation attack. And not only did he attack the Mi'kmaq, he also attacked the Acadians. Jeffrey Amherst was the one who ordered the deportation of the Acadians to take place. And this resulted, of course, in the death of tens of thousands of Acadian and French settlers of Canada. Okay? Now, I'll bring you to the modern time, how the colonialism continued after the deportation, because my parents are the survivors of that. My ancestors are the survivors of these things. What happened was in my family, because we were more Mi'kmaq than we were Acadian, we didn't end up on the boats cast adrift. A lot of the list of the Acadian names, like Thibodeau, and so those are the names of the people as they arrived at the port city. But for the families who fled into the woods, their name was not on the list. So names like the Galien, the Lantagne, those are my family who never made the list of Acadian, but they were Acadian who fled to the wood. Now, when the deportation began, we went from Nova Scotia to northern Quebec to take shelter in reservations up that way. And then eventually we made our way down to Caraquet, New Brunswick. And that's where we settled. And there were land grants issued to my family by way of the governance of the day. So families like, in my family, the land grant was given to Pierre Galien, and it was given to Louis Lantagne, and it was also given to Jacques Doirion. Now, Jacques Doirion was the last surviving member in a family of, I believe it was a family of 12 And he was the last one who survived the smallpox. So in my family, we have the Mi'kmaq, and we have the what do you call, the Métis and the French all blended in. We were given our land grants, and during the time of my parents' grandparents, we were still being subjugated to colonialistic genocide type concepts. And I'll explain how that happened. My mom's grandfather was Laurent Lantagne. He owned a store in Saint-Simon, which is a little area outside Carquette, New Brunswick. And he didn't know how to read. He didn't know numbers. He didn't know how to write. And he owned a shop. And he would keep tabs of all the line of credit by scrawling his own system of handwriting in the barn at the back of the store. And the reason it was like that was because we were forbidden to read. We were absolutely under monitor by the British inspectors who would come into our home and confiscate any book or literature that was visible. And of course, you can't build an economy based on that kind of naivete. And we also had the problem of the lack of the church presence. The church would come into the community only once every few months. And it wasn't consistent because they're trying to break our relationship of the Catholic Church to the Mi'kmaq Métis people to violate, to make us forget the Vatican Concordat of 1610. If we lose our memory of that agreement, if we lose our Catholic faith and we show bad faith to the treaty, we lose the right of the treaty. So they did everything they could to systematically separate the people from the Catholic Church and to suppress our memory of these knowledge. But we were very good at keeping the oral tradition alive because we were Indigenous people. That's how we always did it. So the story continued. Every girl in my family's first name was Maria. All the guys were Joseph. And that was the way that we kept these things going. With or without a priest, there would be baptism. There would be the blessing of the dead. We said the rosary. We had crucifix. We had all these things. But the British used to confiscate the cross. And they used to confiscate the Bible. So these things were well hidden. And it was a system. It was a system. So Laurent Lantagne brought in a girl from Montreal, young thing, probably around 16 years old or so, to teach literacy to his kids. And among the people who learned the literacy was my grandmother, Obeline Lantagne was her maiden name. She ended up marrying Edmond Gallien later on. But Obeline had learned to read because her dad brought this teacher in. And it was all done in secrecy. They had to teach in the attics. They had to teach above the coach house. They had to teach in the cellar with the food. These were forbidden skill sets for the Acadian people. But we were working our way around these things. And then when my parents were born, by the next generation, my mom and dad went to school in a schoolhouse. And I talked to my mom and dad about their education, and it was pretty wild how much the government system tried to keep us suppressed. Basically, the girl who was brought in to teach was about the same age as some of the pupils, a very young girl. And she didn't know math. My father had 120% in mathematics because she didn't know fraction. All of the textbooks that they had to learn from were written in English, and she didn't speak good English. And she didn't actually speak good French either. The people in the village of my parents, when they went to school, they were not taught to conjugate the verb in French the same way that you would have the education in Quebec. So for example, they would teach things like je mange. Okay, je mange. There's no such term. It'd be je mange, right? But je mange, that's how they were taught the French. So there was, my parents describe it as they learn à moi and toi, but nothing of vous and nous, all those other words. So there was a difficulty, and the French to communicate with the Quebecois and to communicate with the people from France. So the Acadian French became something of its own dialect, its own way. And for the most part, it came off as being very ignorant and ill-educated because we were taught like that. It was systematic to make us look like that. And when my parents went to school, they were also taught song from Africa. My dad says, Gole Gole Gonaska was a song that they were taught in school. Why were they teaching African songs to Acadian people? They had no clue. But my parents grew up educated that, okay, well, the Chinese are yellow skinned, the black people are dark skinned, but they didn't know if the dark skin just meant anyone with dark skin, or is that a Negro? That was the term used back then. They divided people by color and by race, and they were teaching these lessons in the school. And it was very weird because it was almost as though the Canadian government tried to connect the idea of a dark-skinned Indigenous person as being a Negro. That's how it came off. When my parents were in school, there was also no knowledge of the tribal names. Our area, we had the Mi'kmaq Maliseet, and I'm told from people who are Maliseet that there was actually no Maliseet. They were Mi'kmaq who sang with the sing-songy type voice. That's what the Maliseet were known as. But there's all these division of the concepts of band names that we have today that didn't exist in my parents' time. In my parents' time, there were only two words for an Indigenous person. It was Indian or sauvage. Sauvage was the term used in French, and that's the one that my parents grew up with. And they were not taught anything of the Indigenous history. They had a history book. I asked my mom, I said, what history did they teach you? She said, we had an English textbook that showed us where Upper and Lower Canada were. But we couldn't read any of the book because it was in English. So we learned the Acadian history, she said. And I said, what did you learn of the Acadian history? She said, I learned about the treaties that were signed, like treaty during the time of, between Britain and the Acadian people. But they weren't taught the names of the people who did the deportation. They didn't know about Cornwallis, Amherst, Moncton, those things. The detail of that was very murky, right? Another thing, too, is that I'm reading a paper of the notes that I took when I spoke with my mom. Oh, yeah, she was in grade 4. Even in grade 4, they couldn't tell time. They didn't learn these basic things. My mom said that when they were small, they did have missionary that would come in and teach the community skill set for like a period of 15 days. They would get missionary coming in to teach the loom to all the women, for example. Or there would be other missionary that come in to teach skill sets of reading that they weren't learning in the school. Things like that took place, and it was very odd, but that was the norm back then. When my parents were in school, another strange thing that took place was that they were forbidden to have the cross and the Acadian flag and the Acadian history taught, even though that's what they were taught. My mom and dad describe it as this. In the classroom, they have rosary, they have crucifix, they have the Bible, they have the Acadian history. As soon as the British inspector would come up the walk of the school, all the children were instructed to hide these things. They were forbidden object. They were deemed forbidden. And that's in the generation of my mom and dad. They're currently in their 80s, but that's what was happening up to the age of my parents. So the children would hide the cross, hide the rosary, hide the Bible, and hide the history book of the Acadian because it was forbidden knowledge. And later on, when the church eventually settled into the area, they started to preach to the people and stuff, and there was a lot of teaching of hell. A lot of fear-based teaching. The priests got involved with the education, and they were cruel. They were smacking kids with leather strap and with wood. And they had molested kids in the neighborhoods of my parents. I know stories about children being born of the priests that were involved with the school. And these were things that were family secrets because people maintained the honor of the women and the men who had been raped. They don't talk of these things, but that happened. And I know of babies born that were the children of the priests of that community. And to restore the dignity, I will not give disclosure on these things, but I do know that those things took place. And they did it to break the faith of the kids. They did it to separate the knowledge of the people from their own treaty, to break our connection to the church, gave them the sense of power of trying to quash our nationalism for the sake of raising their own flag. And these things took place. Okay, so you have a culture of people who are miseducated. You have a culture of people who were taught in a way that projected them as being ignorant, when in fact that was not the case. The education only went up to grade 8, so people were forced to leave the home. They had no choice. There was no money other than the fishing and the logging. There wasn't much else for folks to do. The women would go to New Brunswick and become nanny or nurses, things like that. The concept of having to leave home is still today the same. The lack of the education created a generation of kids who were basically stuck. A lot of the economy died off because people didn't have the support from the Canadian government to create the kind of society that could have been had we had support. I actually have a document secured 1811 when a bishop from Quebec came to audit the area of Caraquet, New Brunswick, and they said the upper part of New Brunswick is of pure blood, the lower one is mixed blood. And this document literally states that, we party too much with the other Indigenous reserve and that we bake bad bread and we're the bottom that feeds the top. So through the church and the way that they reviewed these lands, they targeted which would be the poor communities and which would be the rich communities. And I have those documented. And when my parents tried to get things like banking, they were rejected. And it was a Mi'kmaq and it was a racist thing. And my grandfathers decided to facilitate a long-term solution. So what they did was my grandfather from my dad's side and my mom's side, that would be Edmund Gallian and William Lantagne, got together and started the first credit union. They all pitched in $5 as fishermen to get a credit union happening so that they could actually facilitate a banking system for our people, because Canada did not provide that. Okay? The seeds of fostering a healthy society, from the education, the literacy, and the banking, was denied to us because of our blood, because we were an Indigenous people. And that's why so many people in the Maritime to this day are suffering economically, because they repressed our ability to be self-sufficient. They repressed the support system, psychological, when they tried to divide us away from the faith that we were raised with. They did all these things. Okay? Like, this should be enshrined in part of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee education, is that this government wanted an English society where the English way rules. And they did that by quashing all the other cultures around them. And the Acadian people are still around. Many of us left the Maritime. I was the first child born in Ontario. My parents left because my dad joined the Air Force. But don't think that we lose our sense of history just because we move province. You know? So where did Harper get all his tar sand workers from, eh? They crushed our ability to be self-sufficient, and then they recruited all the kids from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and the Maritimes to work the tar sand. You know, it's that's how they do it. That's how we were screwed over. They screwed over our ability to be self-sufficient so that they can move us wherever they want the jobs to be done. And I, as an Acadian person, see through this scheme because I dug down deep enough into the history to see how they screwed us over. This was colonialism. That's what kept the Acadian people down. Colonialism is what kept Nova Scotia having to leave the island in order to get money. It was systematic. And it's time for the truth to come out so that we can rebuild a better future for all people, be they Métis, be they Mi'kmaq, be they French or English. Anybody has the right to access a bank and a school and to attend a church without harassment. Let's bring back the knowledge of what happened and restore the dignity of the treaty, because the Mi'kmaq people are still Catholic. The Métis people are still Catholic to this day. We didn't give up our end of the deal. Whose nation really is it? Okay? We were a nation in 1610, over 250 years before the Canadian Constitution was even signed. Do Canadians even know that? Thank you very much.